Hi, Dave Coleman here with the second post in the series on zero carbon freight transport. Now, when you think about what stops people from doing much about green logistics, it's either because they don't know where to start, or they start and then find it's difficult because it's complex. There's lots of stakeholders. So what we'll do in this series is show you what's possible. And we'll start today with the basics. What are the fundamental steps to get to net zero and create your own emissions reduction plan for transport? Now let's just check the status of freight transport emissions. They make up 8% of greenhouse gases globally. And the sector is still 99% dependent on oil as a fossil fuel. And volumes are expected to triple by 2050. Now that's a pre-corona estimate, but on that basis, freight emissions will double by 2050 if we don't do anything in particular to reduce emissions. So freight's already a big contributor to climate change. It's the fastest growing sector, and it's one of the hardest to decarbonise. So if we haven't started already, we must start now. Now, I said I'd experiment with technology in delivering these posts, so you'd think I'd have some fancy graphics to present these big numbers and trends to you, but we're not going to get too fancy too fast. We'll start slow. I'm learning as I go. It is an ISO project, so hopefully you will be too. That's the whole idea. So because today we're talking about the basics, I thought I'd start with some basic video communication technology to teach it to you. And in this series, I said we'd be learning from the greatest thinkers. So for this particular post, I'm inspired by Mr. Bob Dylan, who used this technique over 50 years ago. So what is net zero? What does net zero emissions even mean? Well, it's a three-step process where you measure, you reduce, and then you offset. So, to measure, you can't manage what you don't measure. So you really need a baseline to know where you're starting from, and the baseline is critical. It's a critical first step that lets you know whether the work you do later actually works or not. But you need to measure the right things, and you need to measure with integrity. But the measurement will show you where you can start to reduce and what action you can take. Whether it's with the people or the technology that you use and the various equipment, how you organise your own logistics and how that's done between shippers, forwarders and carriers, across supply chains and across networks of supply chains. And then once you've reduced all the emissions that you can profitably, then you offset the remaining emissions. And because with transport, there's always going to be some residual emissions. We can't go totally emissions-free in transport just yet. But what you do is invest in other emission-reducing projects like wind farms or planting trees, and you get credits to the equivalent of your own transport emissions to offset them. And then you become net zero or carbon neutral. Now, a key part of that net zero three-step process was to reduce emissions, because that's our goal after all. You can't just be a dirty emitter and measure and then offset all your emissions to cancel out your pollution. It just doesn't work like that. So how do you reduce? Well, it's another three-step process. You avoid, you shift, and you improve. Now, these principles apply across all sectors, but for freight transport, it looks a bit like this. You avoid freight transport trips altogether. The best thing you can do is reduce the number of trips needed. And then for the trips that you need, you shift from high carbon intensity modes of transport to low intensity modes of transport. So you shift from air to sea, or you shift from road to rail or to sea. And then you improve. The third step is to improve the carbon intensity of the modes that you are using. And you do that through fuel efficiency, and you do that through using low carbon fuels. So another three-step process. How good is that? Well, as it turns out, it's not good enough. The three steps have their limitations. So to build our own transport emission reduction plan, we're going to be guided by the Global Authority on Logistics Emissions, and that's the Smart Freight Centre. And the Smart Freight Centre says that after you measure, the next step is to set targets, and to set targets to reduce your transport emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, and you do that in line with the science. So when applying the three-step process to freight transport, the Smart Freight Centre says it's most effective in practice to break it down to 5 solution areas. It's such a complex area, so to be able to address it, 5 solution areas. So we'll add a bit of colour to this now, and the 5 solution areas are based on the work of Professor Alan McKinnon, who's a leading thinker in how to decarbonise logistics around the world. And the 5 solution areas start with reducing demand for freight transport. So this is where you restructure supply chains to take transport out. 3D printing takes transport out of the game. So it's dematerialising and digitalisation of services. The next step is to optimise freight modes. So the modes that you use, this is shifting again to the best carbon intensity modes suited to the work you need to do and using them in combination. Third area is to utilise your assets. And so, the assets that you have got, utilise them to the max. Share them with others. The vehicles, the containers, the storage warehouses that you have to maximise the capacity utilisation. And then of the vehicles that you do and fleet that you do have, it's about having efficient technology. It's about operating it efficiently. It's about maintaining it efficiently. And then the last solution area is to reduce the carbon content of the energy you're using. So whether it's gas or biofuels, hydrogen, electric vehicles, it's about using the lowest emissions fuel sources for your particular applications and situations that are needed. So we use these 5 areas as our basis for action throughout these series. And the first 4, you can see, are just very good business practices anyway. And then the 5th one builds in that carbon component. So next post, we'll see how these all underpin developing our sustainable logistics roadmap. But for now, you've had an overview of the basic steps you need to take, but it's important to know you can't do it alone. So involve your supply chain partners, get them together in this, start the conversation so that together you can identify and implement what works best for your company, for your goals, for your networks, for your suppliers. So that's it for now. For next post, we'll look at developing your own sustainable logistics roadmap. You can contact me anytime, but until then, keep well.